As the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas hangs by a thread, conflicting reports have emerged regarding Egypt's proposal for a 2-week extension. The proposal, aimed at de-escalating tensions and paving the way for further negotiations, has reportedly been met with a denial from Israeli officials. This development comes amid heightened anxieties and a palpable sense of uncertainty in the region. The Egyptian proposal, according to sources, outlines a 2-week extension to the initial phase of the ceasefire, providing a crucial window for dialogue and a potential roadmap towards a more lasting agreement. A key element of the proposal reportedly involves the release of 3 Israeli hostages currently held by Hamas, along with the return of the bodies of 3 deceased Israelis. This humanitarian gesture, it is hoped, could serve as a confidence-building measure and inject much-needed momentum into the stalled talks. However, in a move that has further muddied the waters, an Israeli official, speaking on condition of anonymity, has stated that they are not familiar with the reported Egyptian proposal. This denial has cast a long shadow over the prospects of a swift resolution to the conflict, leaving observers to grapple with the conflicting narratives and the potential implications for the region's stability. Adding to the confusion, conflicting reports have emerged regarding the possibility of Israeli negotiators traveling to Cairo to engage in face-to-face talks with their Egyptian counterparts. While some media outlets have suggested that a delegation is indeed en route to Cairo, these claims have been vehemently denied by Israeli officials, further deepening the sense of uncertainty and raising questions about the true nature of the back-channel diplomacy at play. The already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza has been exacerbated by Israel's recent decision to halt the flow of humanitarian aid into the besieged enclave. This move, widely condemned by international organizations, has raised fears of a looming humanitarian catastrophe and accusations of collective punishment being meted out to the Palestinian population. The decision to halt aid, according to Israeli officials, is directly linked to Hamas's rejection of the Witkoff framework, a U.S.-backed proposal that outlined a phased approach to the release of hostages and the establishment of a permanent ceasefire. The framework, spearheaded by Trump envoy Steve Witkoff, called for the immediate release of half of the remaining Israeli hostages, with the remaining hostages to be freed upon the successful conclusion of negotiations leading to a lasting peace agreement. However, Hamas has vehemently rejected the Witkoff framework, denouncing it as a non-starter and accusing Israel of using the humanitarian plight of Gazans as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. This impasse, with both sides digging in their heels, has created a dangerous stalemate, with the lives and well-being of millions of Palestinians hanging in the balance. The halting of aid has drawn sharp criticism from international organizations, with human rights groups accusing Israel of violating international law and exacerbating an already dire humanitarian crisis. The move has also sparked protests within Gaza, with residents expressing their anger and frustration at being caught in the crossfire of a conflict that seems to offer no easy solutions. The negotiations between Israel and Hamas have reached an impasse, with both sides entrenched in their positions and unwilling to make the concessions necessary to break the deadlock. The key sticking points remain the release of Israeli hostages and the lifting of the blockade on Gaza, issues that have long been at the heart of the conflict. Hamas, for its part, has insisted that the release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails must be a central component of any ceasefire agreement. They argue that these prisoners, many of whom have been incarcerated for years, are political prisoners, and their release is a matter of principle. Additionally, Hamas has demanded an end to the crippling blockade on Gaza, which they argue has turned the enclave into an open-air prison and inflicted immense suffering on its inhabitants. Israel, however, has remained steadfast in its refusal to countenance the release of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom they consider to be terrorists with blood on their hands. They view the demand for the lifting of the blockade as equally unacceptable, arguing that it would allow Hamas to rearm and pose a renewed threat to Israeli security. Instead, Israel has proposed a phased approach, linking the release of hostages and the easing of the blockade to tangible progress towards a permanent ceasefire, and guarantees from Hamas that it will cease all hostile activities. This fundamental difference in positions, with neither side willing to budge on its core demands, has created a seemingly insurmountable obstacle to progress. The lack of trust between the two parties, further eroded by years of conflict and broken promises, has only served to deepen the divide and make finding common ground seem like an impossible dream. As the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, international pressure is mounting on both Israel and Hamas to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Various international actors, including the United States, Egypt, and the United Nations, have been engaged in frantic diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire and prevent a further escalation of violence. The United States, a staunch ally of Israel, has been vocal in its support for Israel's right to defend itself against what it describes as terrorist attacks by Hamas. However, the Biden administration has also expressed concern over the humanitarian situation in Gaza and called for restraint from both sides. The U.S. has also pledged millions of dollars in humanitarian aid to Gaza, seeking to alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians caught in the crossfire. Egypt, which has long played a mediating role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has been working tirelessly to bridge the gap between the two sides and find a mutually acceptable path forward. Their efforts have focused on securing a ceasefire, addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and laying the groundwork for a resumption of negotiations. The United Nations, through its various agencies, has been providing humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza, but its efforts have been hampered by the ongoing violence and the restrictions imposed by Israel. The UN has called for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered access for humanitarian aid, and a return to negotiations aimed at finding a lasting solution to the conflict. Despite these international efforts, the situation on the ground remains volatile and unpredictable. The ceasefire remains fragile, with the risk of renewed hostilities looming large. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to worsen, with the halt of aid exacerbating an already dire situation. The path to a peaceful resolution remains elusive, with both sides seemingly locked in a zero-sum game where compromise is seen as weakness.